Every Friday evening, something happens inside your body. Your shoulders drop, your breathing changes. A weight you didn't even know you were carrying lifts off your chest. The weekend is here. 2 days that belong to you. But those 2 days didn't exist for most of human history. For thousands of years, the idea that ordinary working people deserved regularly scheduled time to rest, to do nothing, to simply live, that idea would have sounded insane. And the reason you have a Saturday off right now has almost nothing to do with anyone caring about your well-being. It has everything to do with drunk workers, religious conflict, and a car manufacturer who realized that exhausted people don't buy enough things. By the end of this, you'll know exactly who built the weekend, why they did it, and the uncomfortable truth about what your free time was actually designed for. Before the weekend. For most of human civilization, there was no weekend. The concept didn't exist. The word itself didn't appear in English until 1879, and even then it described a half day on Saturday afternoon, not the 2 full days you know today. Go back to the early 1800s, to the factories of northern England and the mills of New England, and you'll find a work schedule that would break a modern person in weeks, 6 days a week, often 7, 14 to 16 hours a day, starting before sunrise, ending after dark. Children as young as 7 standing at machines for the same hours as adults. No lunch break. Workers ate standing at their stations if they ate at all. Sunday was technically a day of rest, but only because the church demanded it, and even that was contested. Factory owners resented losing a day of production. In many industries, Sunday rest just meant shorter hours, not a full day off. The expectation was simple and total. Your time belonged to whoever paid you, all of it. There were no holidays in the modern sense, no vacation days, no concept of personal time. If you didn't show up, you didn't get paid. If you missed too many days, you were replaced. The factory didn't care about your exhaustion, your family, or your health. It needed your body at the machine, and it needed it every day the machine was running. This was the reality for hundreds of millions of people. Not as a temporary hardship during wartime or crisis, but as the permanent, normal, unchangeable structure of working life. The idea that workers had a right to free time, that rest was something the economy owed them, not something they stole, didn't exist yet. And the first crack in that wall came from an unlikely place: workers who simply refused to show up on Monday. Saint Monday. Starting in the 1600s and persisting well into the 1800s, a peculiar tradition spread through the working classes of England. Workers, especially craftsmen, cobblers, weavers, and metalworkers, would skip work on Monday. They'd spend the day recovering from Sunday, which was their one day off and therefore their one day to drink. The hangover carried into Monday, and Monday became, informally, a second day of rest. They called it Saint Monday, not because it was religious, because the joke was that they treated Monday with the same reverence they were supposed to give Sunday. It was a small, quiet act of rebellion. Workers couldn't demand more time off. They had no unions, no labor laws, no collective bargaining power. They just didn't show up. Factory owners were furious. Absenteeism on Monday was costing them significant production. They tried fines, they tried docking pay, they tried firing and replacing workers. None of it worked consistently, because the practice was so widespread that there often weren't enough replacement workers who wouldn't do the same thing. Here's what made Saint Monday so powerful. It wasn't organized. There was no leader, no petition, no strike fund. It was thousands of individual workers, independently and simultaneously, deciding that they needed more rest, and simply taking it. The factories couldn't fire everyone. And the lost production on Mondays, in some industries, output dropped by a third, was bleeding profit. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Some factory owners in England, particularly in the textile industry during the 1840s and 1850s, began experimenting with a compromise. Instead of fighting Saint Monday forever, they offered workers a half-day off on Saturday afternoon, but only if they showed up reliably every other day, including Monday. The deal was explicit. We'll give you Saturday afternoon, but Monday belongs to us. It worked. Productivity on Monday improved. Workers had their half-day of freedom on Saturday and used it for shopping, socializing, watching sports. Saturday afternoon became the weekend, literally the end of the working week. The word appeared in an English magazine in 1879, describing this exact arrangement. Notice what happened. Workers weren't given time off because someone decided they deserved rest. They were given time off because their rebellion was costing factory owners money, and the half Saturday was cheaper than the lost Monday. The weekend wasn't a gift. It was a negotiation, and the workers' leverage was the simple, stubborn act of not showing up. The religious collision. While English factory workers were drinking their way to a half Saturday, another force was shaping the weekend from a completely different direction. In the United States by the late 1800s, Jewish immigrants had arrived in huge numbers, particularly in New York City. Jewish law required observance of the Sabbath, Shabbat, from Friday evening through Saturday evening. No work, no commerce, no exceptions. For Jewish garment workers, this created an impossible conflict. The standard American work schedule was 6 days, Monday through Saturday, with Sunday off for Christian worship. Jewish workers couldn't work on Saturday. Christian workers couldn't work on Sunday. Factory owners, many of whom were themselves Jewish, faced a dilemma. Which day do you shut down? If you closed Saturday, you lost Christian workers who wouldn't come back Sunday. If you closed Sunday, your Jewish workers had to choose between their faith and their paycheck. The tension was real and widespread. Jewish labor leaders, particularly in New York's garment district, began pushing for a 5-day work week as the solution. Close Saturday and Sunday. Everyone gets their Sabbath. Everyone gets rest. The proposal wasn't framed as religious accommodation, it was framed as labor reform. But the engine behind it was the collision of two religious calendars inside the same economy. In 1908, a New England cotton mill became one of the earliest documented American factories to adopt a 5-day work week, specifically to accommodate its Jewish workforce. Other factories in heavily Jewish industries followed, but the practice remained rare, a niche solution for a specific problem. It would take something much bigger to make the 2-day weekend universal. Not a moral argument, not a religious compromise, a business calculation made by the richest industrialist on the planet. Ford's revelation. On September 25, 1926, Henry Ford announced that all Ford Motor Company factories would adopt a 5-day, 40-hour work week. Workers would get Saturday and Sunday off, and their pay would not be reduced. In fact, Ford had already raised daily wages years earlier to the famous $5 a day, more than double the industry average at the time. Other industrialists thought he'd lost his mind. Giving workers an entire extra day off while paying the same wage seemed like corporate suicide. The National Association of Manufacturers openly opposed the idea. The business press was skeptical, but Ford hadn't suddenly developed a conscience. He'd developed a theory, and it was ruthlessly logical. Ford understood something that most factory owners of his era didn't. Workers weren't just production inputs, they were also consumers. The same hands assembling cars on Monday were the same hands that could buy cars on Saturday. But a person who works 6 days a week, from dawn to dusk, has no time to spend money, no time to drive, no time to take a trip that requires gasoline, no time to want things. Ford wrote about this explicitly. In interviews, he argued that leisure time was an economic necessity, not a luxury. People who have more leisure must have more clothes, he said. They eat a greater variety of food. They require more transportation. Workers with free time would become consumers. Consumers would drive demand. Demand would drive production. And production would generate profits that more than offset the cost of the extra day off. This wasn't generosity. It was market engineering. Ford didn't give workers time off so they could rest. He gave them time off so they'd have time to spend. The weekend, in Ford's vision, existed to serve the economy, not the worker. Here's the part that should make you pause. He was right. The 5-day week at Ford didn't reduce output. Productivity per hour actually increased because rested workers made fewer mistakes and worked faster. Absenteeism dropped. Turnover dropped. The math worked. Other companies watched Ford's results and, one by one, followed. Not because of worker pressure, not because of government mandate, because the numbers proved that giving people time off was more profitable than working them to exhaustion. The weekend spread through American industry during the late 1920s and into the 1930s, driven not by competitive compassion, but by competitive pressure. If Ford's workers were more productive and buying more goods, companies that didn't match his schedule were falling behind. Something else happened that Ford probably didn't predict, but that reshaped the entire economy. The weekend created industries. Saturday shopping became a ritual. Saturday sports became a business. Sunday drives became the foundation of the American automobile market. The motel industry, the roadside restaurant, the leisure economy, entertainment, tourism, hospitality, retail, exploded in the decades after the weekend became standard. Entire sectors of the modern economy exist because someone decided that workers needed 2 days off. Not for the workers' sake, but because idle hands with money in their pockets turned out to be the most powerful engine of economic growth anyone had ever seen. The law catches up. The Great Depression changed the equation again. By the early 1930s, unemployment in the United States had reached 25%. Millions of people had no work at all, while those who still had jobs were often working crushing hours for declining wages. The logic shifted. If there weren't enough jobs for everyone, maybe the solution was to spread the available work across more people by capping how many hours each person could work. Shorter hours for the employed meant more positions for the unemployed. It was work sharing disguised as labor reform. In 1933, the Senate actually passed a bill, the Black-Connery Bill, that would have established a 30-hour work week. 30 hours. President Roosevelt ultimately backed away from it under pressure from business interests, but the appetite for shorter hours was undeniable. What did pass was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. It established the 40-hour workweek as the legal standard, required overtime pay for anything beyond 40 hours, set a minimum wage, and banned child labor in most industries. The 5-day, 40-hour week wasn't recommended. It was law. Even here, though, the motivation was tangled. The act wasn't purely about worker welfare. It was about economic stabilization, managing the labor supply during a crisis. The number 40 wasn't based on any study of human performance or optimal rest. It was a compromise between business interests that wanted more hours and labor unions that wanted fewer. The 40-hour ceiling stuck not because it was scientifically correct, but because it was politically achievable. And that number, 40 hours, 5 days, hasn't moved since. Nearly 9 decades later, despite radical transformations in technology, productivity, and the nature of work itself, the legal framework of the workweek remains frozen in 1938. Consider what has changed since then. In 1938, most work was physical. You stood at a machine. You carried things. You built things with your hands. The 40-hour cap existed partly because human bodies genuinely break down under sustained physical labor. Factory injuries spiked sharply after the 10th hour of a shift. But the economy has shifted. Most workers in developed countries now sit at desks. They answer emails. They attend meetings. The physical constraints that justified the original limit barely apply anymore. Yet the schedule remains, not because it still makes sense, but because it was carved into law at a specific moment and nobody has bothered to carve a new one. What your weekend was built for. Pull back and trace the full thread. The weekend didn't emerge from a single moment or a single mind. It was assembled, piece by piece, across centuries, by forces that were rarely altruistic. English factory workers got a half Saturday not because someone valued their rest, but because their Monday absences were expensive. Jewish immigrants pushed for a 5-day week not as a labor movement, but as a religious necessity. Henry Ford gave workers 2 full days off, not out of kindness, but because he needed consumers, not just laborers. And the government made it law not because 40 hours was the right number for human flourishing, but because the economy was collapsing and politicians needed a pressure valve. Every step was an economic calculation. Every concession was a response to a problem, not a vision of a better life. And here's what that means for you. Sitting in your Saturday morning, drinking your coffee, scrolling your phone. The 2 days you think of as yours, they were designed to make you a better worker and a more active consumer. Ford said it out loud. People with free time buy more. The weekend exists because it makes the economy run more efficiently. Your leisure is a feature of the production cycle. Even your rest is optimized for someone else's balance sheet. The structure of your week, 5 days on, 2 days off, is not a natural rhythm. It's not based on how your body works, how your mind recovers, or how humans have organized time across most of history. It's an artifact of industrial-era bargaining that hardened into law during a depression and has never been seriously revisited. Meanwhile, the nature of work has transformed beyond recognition. Most people in developed economies no longer stand at machines in factories. Knowledge work, service work, remote work, none of these follow the rhythms of the assembly line. Your laptop doesn't need you to be physically present at a specific station from 9 to 5. Your productivity doesn't come in hour-long units that can be neatly divided into shifts. Yet the schedule remains, 5 days on, 2 days off. Not because it works, because nobody has changed it. The frozen clock. Countries around the world have begun testing the 4-day workweek. Trials in Iceland, the United Kingdom, Japan, and elsewhere have consistently shown the same results Ford discovered a century ago. Shorter hours don't reduce output. In many cases, productivity goes up, employee health improves, turnover drops, the numbers work. Adoption, though, remains slow, and the resistance doesn't come from data, because the data supports shorter weeks. The resistance comes from the same place it always has, the deep, unexamined assumption that time at work equals value produced, that more hours means more dedication, that being busy is the same as being productive. These beliefs predate the evidence, and they survive despite it. Your great-grandparents fought for the right to not work on Saturday. Some of them were beaten for it. Some of them were fired. Some of them simply refused to show up on Monday and forced the system to bend. What they won, 2 days out of 7, felt like a revolution at the time. And in many ways it was. It was also a compromise. And compromises, once written into law, tend to calcify. The weekend was a radical idea in 1926. By 1938, it was law. By 1960, it was invisible. Nobody questioned it. Nobody wondered whether 2 days was the right number, or whether the structure itself still made sense. The 5-day week became like the air, something you breathe without thinking about, something that shapes every decision you make without ever announcing its presence. Your vacations are planned around it. Your relationships are built within it. Your hobbies fit the scraps of time it leaves you. The rhythm of your week, the exhaustion of Wednesday, the anticipation of Friday, the dread of Sunday night. All of it flows from a structure that was assembled from drunken cobblers, religious calendars, and a car salesman's insight about consumer spending. You were born into a world where the 5-day week was already set, already assumed, already as permanent feeling as the sunrise. The schedule was waiting for you before your first day of school, shaping how your parents lived, how your teachers taught, how every institution around you organized time. You never agreed to it. You never even considered an alternative. Closing, tomorrow is Sunday, and on Monday morning an alarm will drag billions of people out of bed, back to the same schedule that was negotiated between hungover cobblers and frustrated factory owners 200 years ago. The weekend you just enjoyed was invented, not discovered, and the people who built it weren't thinking about your happiness. They were thinking about their bottom line. Maybe the question isn't whether you're grateful for your 2 days off. Maybe the question is, who decided 2 was enough? If this made you think twice about the invisible schedule running your life, subscribe. We trace the hidden origins of the rules you never agreed to and show you who wrote them.